Last summer, my family and I rented a house in Asheville, North Carolina for a week-long vacation. It was supposed to be a relaxing break. Asheville's got that perfect mix of outdoorsy stuff and good food, and we thought it would be fun to stay somewhere different from the usual hotel routine. We booked an Airbnb, a house that looked rustic and charming just outside of town. From the photos, it seemed perfect. A big porch, an old stone fireplace, and plenty of space for me, my wife, and our 2 kids. The house was a little older, but it had a cozy, lived-in vibe. The kind of place you'd expect to see quilts and old family photos hanging on the walls. It felt like staying in someone's home rather than just a rental. The owner had left a note with some basic instructions: Wi-Fi password, trash days, and a suggestion to watch out for wildlife since the house was surrounded by woods. There was even a handwritten message on the kitchen counter that said to enjoy the peace and quiet. That part stuck out to me for some reason, but I shrugged it off. We arrived late in the afternoon, unloaded the car, and settled in. The first thing we noticed was how quiet it really was. There wasn't much noise except for the occasional chirping of birds or rustling of leaves outside. It was nice, but also kind of eerie. Coming from a city, you're not used to that level of silence. The first night was uneventful. We made dinner, played some board games, and called it an early night. I slept well, and so did my wife and the kids. No issues, nothing out of the ordinary. But the next morning, during breakfast, I thought I heard something from upstairs, a kind of faint tapping noise. I assumed it was the old house settling or something. It wasn't loud, just barely noticeable, but it gave me pause. I mentioned it to my wife, and she shrugged, saying old houses make weird noises. She was right. I didn't think too much about it. Later that day, we spent most of the afternoon hiking in the nearby Pisgah National Forest. The kids loved it, and we were all pretty wiped out by the time we got back to the house. We made dinner again, watched a movie, and the kids went to bed. My wife and I stayed up a little later, just chatting and drinking wine. That's when I heard it again, another faint noise from upstairs, but this time it was more like footsteps. It sounded like they were coming from the attic. I mentioned it to my wife again, but she didn't hear anything. We were both tired, so we went to bed, and I told myself I was probably just imagining things. Old houses creak, right? But as I lay there trying to fall asleep, I couldn't ignore it. The noises were so subtle, but they were there, a soft creaking, followed by what I was sure were footsteps. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand, and went to investigate. The kids were sound asleep in their room, and everything seemed fine on the main floor. I hadn't even realized the house had an attic until that moment. There was a small door in the ceiling of the hallway, the kind you'd have to pull down a ladder to access. The idea of going up there gave me the creeps, especially in the middle of the night, so I decided to leave it alone for the time being. I convinced myself it was just some animal or something moving around in the walls. Maybe a raccoon had found its way into the attic. Not a big deal. The next morning things got a little weirder. My wife noticed that a few small things had been moved in the kitchen. A coffee mug that she swore she left in the sink was now on the counter, and a box of cereal that had been tucked away in the pantry was out on the kitchen table. It wasn't a huge deal, but it was strange. We both assumed one of the kids had gotten up during the night for a snack and didn't remember, so we let it slide. But as the day went on, I couldn't stop thinking about the noises from the night before. We spent most of that day exploring downtown Asheville, hitting up some shops and grabbing lunch. The kids were having a blast, and my wife was in a great mood, but the thought of those footsteps kept nagging at me. When we got back to the house, I decided to check the attic just to put my mind at ease. I waited until the kids were busy watching TV, and I pulled down the ladder to the attic. The moment I did, a musty, stale smell hit me. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough to make me hesitate. I climbed up slowly, shining my flashlight into the dark space above. The attic wasn't very big, just a cramped, dusty room with old insulation and a few wooden beams. There were some old boxes stacked up in the corner, but nothing that looked out of the ordinary. No sign of any animals or anything that would explain the noises. Still, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but being up there alone in the dark made my skin crawl. I backed down the ladder feeling unsettled but not sure why. When I got back downstairs, my wife asked me if I found anything, and I told her no. I didn't want to freak her out, especially since there wasn't any real evidence that anything was wrong. That night, though, things escalated. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound coming from the kitchen. It was faint, but it sounded like someone moving around, like the soft clinking of dishes. I lay there for a minute, trying to convince myself that I was just hearing things. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, definitely the sound of someone moving around downstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I could see that my wife was still asleep beside me, and the kids' door was closed. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept out of the bedroom. The house was pitch dark, but I could hear the sound of footsteps coming from the kitchen. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tiptoed toward the source of the noise. When I reached the kitchen, everything looked normal. The lights were off, the dishes were still in the sink, and there was no one there. I stood there for a moment listening, but the noise had stopped. I checked the doors and windows, all of which were locked, and then I went back to bed, feeling more on edge than ever. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to my wife again. She seemed concerned, but still didn't think it was a big deal. She suggested that maybe we were both just tired from the long days of hiking and sightseeing, and maybe we were imagining things. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Things took a turn for the worse later that day. We had planned to spend most of the day at the Biltmore estate, so we left the house around 9 a.m. and didn't get back until early evening. When we walked in, something immediately felt off. It was hard to explain, but the air in the house felt different, heavier maybe. The kids ran off to their room and my wife went to the kitchen to start dinner. That's when she called me over. The back door, which we had locked before we left, was slightly open. Not wide open, just cracked, like someone had tried to close it but didn't latch it all the way. My stomach dropped. I checked the house, but nothing seemed out of place. No sign of a break-in, no broken windows. Everything looked exactly the same as when we left, except for that door. At this point, I was starting to feel paranoid. I didn't want to scare my wife or the kids, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the house while we were gone. I checked the attic again, but it was still empty, just as I'd left it the day before. I even checked the basement, but found nothing unusual. That night was the worst of all. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were louder, heavier, like someone walking directly above us. It wasn't just the occasional creak anymore, it was a steady, deliberate pace, like someone was moving around up there. My heart was pounding in my chest as I lay there, listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I got out of bed again, but this time I didn't go straight to the attic. Instead, I walked around the house, checking every room, every door, every window. Everything was locked just as it had been before, but the footsteps continued, coming from the attic. I knew I had to check it one last time, but the thought of going up there terrified me. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The attic looked the same as before, dark and dusty, but as I swept the light across the room, something caught my eye. In the far corner, behind the boxes, there was a pile of blankets and empty food wrappers. It was small, but it was there, tucked away like someone had been hiding up there. My blood ran cold. I backed down the ladder as quickly and quietly as I could, my mind racing. Someone had been living in the attic. Someone had been sneaking down while we were out or asleep, eating our food and moving things around. I didn't know how long they had been there or what they wanted, but I knew we couldn't stay in that house any longer. I woke up my wife, and we packed our bags as quickly as we could. We didn't tell the kids what was going on, just that we were leaving early. We checked into a hotel for the rest of the trip and never went back to that house. I reported everything to Airbnb, but they didn't seem too concerned. I never found out who was living in the attic or what they were doing there, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that we had been staying in that house with a stranger, and they had been watching us the whole time. This happened a while ago, but it still messes with my head when I think about it. I'd been planning a weekend trip to Portland, Oregon with my girlfriend. Nothing fancy, just some time away from the usual routine. We both worked demanding jobs, so we needed the break. We've done Airbnb stays a few times before, never had any problems. We picked this cute little place in a quiet neighborhood. It looked perfect. Old, charming house, vintage decor, lots of positive reviews. It felt right for us. We arrived on a Friday evening. I remember the weather was perfect, late summer, warm but not too hot, and the sun was setting as we pulled up to the place. The house was exactly like the pictures, maybe even better in person. It had this classic look with ivy climbing up the sides, a little porch with a swing, and the host had left the key in a lockbox as promised. We let ourselves in, and everything seemed totally normal. The first thing I noticed when we walked in was how spotless the place was. It was almost like no one had ever stayed there. The furniture was perfectly arranged, not a speck of dust. The floors practically gleamed. It didn't feel lived in, you know? Not even in the usual cleaned up for guests way, more like it was staged. Still, we didn't think much of it. I guess we figured the host just took extra care. We dumped our bags, did a quick tour of the place, and decided to head out to grab some dinner. The layout was simple. One bedroom, a small living room, and an even smaller kitchen. Nothing fancy, but it felt cozy, like an old-school cottage or something. There were a few decorative mirrors on the walls, one in the living room, one in the bedroom. The mirrors stood out to me for some reason. They were pretty big, like the kind you'd find in an antique store, but they didn't really fit with the rest of the decor. I thought it was odd, but not enough to make me uncomfortable. We went out for dinner at a little spot downtown, and when we came back, it was already dark. The house was completely quiet, just like the whole street, which was nice. I was honestly looking forward to getting a good night's sleep. We spent some time unwinding, watching a movie on my laptop in bed, and then we turned in for the night. The first night was fine, nothing out of the ordinary. I slept like a rock, actually. The next day, we decided to check out some of the local spots around Portland. Bookstores, coffee shops, that sort of thing. It was a good day, and we didn't think about the house much. But when we got back that evening, things started to feel a little off. It's hard to describe exactly, but the air inside felt different. It wasn't cold or musty, but it just felt like the kind of air that makes you feel heavy, like there was pressure in the atmosphere. Again, nothing too alarming, just a weird vibe. That night, I was in the kitchen making tea before bed, and my girlfriend called me from the bedroom. She said there was a weird light coming from one of the smoke detectors. I went in, and sure enough, there was this faint blinking light that I hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, almost like the kind of light you'd see on a camera when it's on standby. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was just part of the device, maybe a battery indicator or something. But once I saw that, I started noticing other things. There was another smoke detector in the living room, also with a faint blinking light. Same in the kitchen. All in places you wouldn't really look at twice. Then there were the mirrors. Something about the way they were angled bugged me. I'd noticed them the first day, but now they felt off, the one in the living room especially. It was positioned directly opposite the couch, almost like someone wanted it to capture the whole room. I started wondering if they could be two-way mirrors or something like that, but I had no idea how to tell. I didn't want to freak my girlfriend out, so I kept my thoughts to myself, but I was feeling pretty unsettled by this point. That night I didn't sleep as well. Every little noise in the house felt amplified, and I couldn't stop thinking about those detectors. I even got out of bed at one point to inspect them more closely. They looked like normal smoke detectors, but the light kept blinking at a steady pace. I thought about reaching out to the host, but it was late, and I figured I was just being paranoid. Sunday morning, we got up early and headed out again. We didn't spend much time in the house that day. It was mostly just a place to sleep at this point. By the time we came back in the evening, I was starting to get more anxious about the whole situation. It was a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I knew something wasn't right. We packed up most of our stuff that night since we were planning to leave early the next day. As I was zipping up my suitcase, I noticed something strange on the ceiling near the corner of the room. It looked like a small hole, just big enough to maybe fit a tiny camera lens. That's when my stomach dropped. It didn't look like a typical hole for wiring or anything like that, and I couldn't imagine any reason why it would be there. I didn't say anything to my girlfriend because I didn't want to freak her out more than I already was. I couldn't stop staring at it. I got on a chair to inspect it closer, but it was just out of reach. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and tried to get a better look. I still couldn't tell what it was, but my gut told me it wasn't supposed to be there. I finally broke down and decided to message the host. I kept it casual, asked if there was anything in the ceiling like wiring or some kind of sensor. No response. I tried calling and it went straight to voicemail. That night I couldn't sleep at all. Every little noise, every creak of the house made me more anxious. I kept staring at the ceiling, convinced there was a camera hidden there. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt exposed, like I was being watched, even though I didn't have any hard proof. The blinking lights on the smoke detectors kept catching my eye, and I swear I heard faint noises coming from the attic, like the sound of something shifting or scraping above us. I didn't know what to do at that point. It was too late to find another place, and I didn't want to leave in the middle of the night with nowhere to go. I figured we could tough it out until morning, but I was restless, barely dozing off for maybe an hour or two. Every time I opened my eyes, I kept scanning the room, half expecting to see something, anything that would explain the weirdness of the place. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun came up, we grabbed our bags and got the hell out of there. I didn't even bother making the bed or cleaning up. I just wanted to be gone. We didn't stop until we were a good distance away, back in the city, at a coffee shop. Only then did I start piecing everything together. I Googled hidden cameras in Airbnbs, and to my surprise, it wasn't as uncommon as I thought. There were tons of stories just like mine. People finding cameras and smoke detectors, mirrors, even vents. I couldn't shake the thought that we'd been recorded the entire weekend. Maybe it was paranoia, but the more I thought about it, the more everything started to add up. The too clean house, the mirrors, the strategically placed smoke detectors, the unresponsive host. I contacted Airbnb support later that day and reported everything. They said they'd look into it, and that they took these matters seriously, but I never heard back from them beyond that. I didn't press it any further because, honestly, I just wanted to forget about the whole thing. To this day, I don't know if there were really cameras in that house or if I was just being paranoid. But after reading about other people's experiences, I'm convinced something was going on. It's been months since that trip, and I still get chills thinking about it. We haven't used Airbnb since. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I don't think I'll ever feel comfortable staying in someone else's home again. If you ever stay in an Airbnb, check the smoke detectors, check the mirrors, and trust your gut. A few months ago, I booked an Airbnb in a small town in upstate New York. It wasn't too far from Albany, but far enough that it felt like a proper escape from the city. I was going through a rough time. Work had been non-stop, my relationship had just ended, and I was overwhelmed with everything. So I decided to get away for a long weekend and just be by myself for a bit. I found this cabin on Airbnb and it looked perfect. It was about 20 minutes outside of a small town called Catskill in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and hills. It had that rustic charm with wooden furniture, a cozy fireplace, and a porch that overlooked a creek. The pictures showed it was secluded, with no other houses in sight, and I loved the idea of not having to deal with people for a few days. The reviews were mostly positive, quiet, peaceful, private, exactly what I was looking for. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The directions were straightforward, though the last few miles were a bit tricky since I lost cell service as soon as I left the main road. But the instructions from the host were clear enough, and I eventually found the place. The cabin was even more beautiful in person. It was nestled at the edge of a thick forest, and the only sounds were the rustling of trees and the occasional bird. I immediately felt like I'd made the right decision to come here. I let myself in with the key from the lockbox and took a quick tour around the cabin. It was small, just a living area with the fireplace, a tiny kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything was clean and exactly like the photos, though it had a bit of that musty smell you get in places that haven't been lived in for a while. I dropped my bags in the bedroom, made myself some tea, and settled into one of the big armchairs by the fireplace. It was everything I needed, quiet, cozy, and completely cut off from the world. No distractions. The first night was uneventful. I made myself some dinner, read a little, and then went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, though the house creaked a bit more than I expected, probably from the wind or just the age of the place. I've always been a light sleeper, so I woke up a few times during the night but didn't think much of it. Every cabin makes noises, and it didn't feel unusual for a place like this. The next day, I spent most of the afternoon hiking through the woods nearby. There were some trails that the host had mentioned in his welcome message, and I spent hours wandering around, enjoying the quiet and fresh air. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my head, get some space from everything. I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, exhausted but feeling good. I made myself some dinner, sat out on the porch for a while, and watched the sun set over the trees. There was this sense of calm, like I could finally breathe again. That night, though, things started to feel a little off. I went to bed early again, planning to get a full night's sleep. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to this noise. It wasn't a loud noise, just this soft creaking sound like the front door opening slowly. At first I thought I was dreaming or maybe imagining it, but I was wide awake now. I lay there listening, but everything was quiet again. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just the wind or maybe the house settling. But I couldn't shake how real it had sounded. I got up, grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight, and walked to the living room. The front door was closed, just like I'd left it. I checked the lock. It was still secure. I felt a little stupid for getting freaked out by what was probably just the wind. I went back to bed, but it took me a while to fall asleep. The next morning I shrugged it off. I told myself that staying alone in a cabin in the middle of the woods can play tricks on your mind. I wasn't used to that kind of silence, and every little sound seemed amplified. I had another relaxing day, mostly reading and writing, and by the afternoon I felt a lot better about things. That night, though, was when things got worse. I went to bed early again, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. It wasn't like I was scared exactly, but there was something about being so isolated that made me hyper-aware of every little noise. I kept thinking about the creaking door from the night before, how it had sounded so real. I eventually fell asleep, but around 1 a.m. I woke up to a much more distinct noise, footsteps. They were faint but steady, coming from the living room area. I lay there frozen, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't quite managing it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline kick in. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight again, but I didn't get up right away. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make any noise. I was scared that if I moved, whoever was out there would know I was awake. I listened for what felt like forever, but the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear anything else, just the usual creaks and groans of the cabin. After a few minutes, I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed. I crept into the living room, keeping the flashlight low, trying not to make any noise. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. Everything looked normal. But I knew what I'd heard. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the door, trying to make sense of it. I didn't hear anything else that night, but I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear some small noise, the wind, the trees, the house, and my heart would start racing again. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted but relieved that it was daylight again. That morning, I debated packing up and leaving early. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind like something wasn't right. I decided to stay though, figuring I could handle one more night. I spent most of the day outside trying to stay away from the cabin. I took another hike, drove into town for lunch, and didn't come back until late afternoon. When I got back, I was still feeling uneasy, but I was determined to make it through the night. I had a glass of wine with dinner, hoping it would help me relax and maybe get some sleep. But as soon as the sun went down, I felt that creeping anxiety again. I tried to distract myself, reading and scrolling through my phone, but I kept listening for any sounds. Around midnight, I heard it again. The creak of the front door. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to hear. The door didn't fully open, but I could hear it shifting on its hinges, like someone was testing it, seeing if it would make noise. Then, just like the night before, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the living room, careful not to wake me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was too scared to get up, to check. I just lay there, gripping my phone, listening. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped again. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I was too terrified to sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept waiting for something else to happen. The next morning, I didn't even hesitate. I packed up my stuff and left as soon as it was light out. I didn't bother checking the door or the windows again. I just wanted to get out of there. When I got home, I thought about reporting it to Airbnb, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps in the middle of the night, that I thought someone was trying to break in. There was no proof, nothing concrete, just this overwhelming feeling that something wasn't right. I ended up not saying anything, just chalking it up to my imagination running wild. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about those footsteps. They were too real, too deliberate. I keep replaying that weekend in my head, trying to convince myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But part of me knows that someone was in that cabin with me, and I'll never stay in an Airbnb alone again.
A few months ago, my friend and I decided to take a weekend trip to Seattle. We've both been to the city before, but never really got to explore it properly. We're both in our mid-20s, work full-time, and we wanted to get away for a few days, just to relax and experience some of the city's art and food scene. It seemed like the perfect idea at the time. We booked an Airbnb in a quiet suburb about 20 minutes outside of downtown. The place was listed as a basement unit in a house that had been converted into a guest space. The pictures looked cozy enough, small but with a nice living area, a bedroom with 2 beds, and a little kitchen. It was a good deal too, cheaper than the hotels, so we went for it. We arrived in Seattle on a Friday afternoon and decided to head straight to the Airbnb to drop off our bags before grabbing dinner. The drive from downtown was easy enough, but as we got closer to the house, things started to feel a little off. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. I don't know how to explain it, but there was barely any movement. No kids playing outside, no people walking their dogs, nothing. Just rows of houses, each one looking like the last. Still, it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. We figured it was just one of those sleepy suburban areas where everyone keeps to themselves. The house itself was pretty nondescript. It was an old 2-story home, nothing fancy, with a small front yard that looked like it hadn't been taken care of in a while. The host wasn't there to greet us, but she had left a message with instructions on how to get in. There was a side door that led down to the basement, and we had to use a temporary lock on the door because, according to the host, the main lock was being repaired. That was the first red flag, but we brushed it off. The temporary lock was one of those old-fashioned padlocks that you'd see on a storage unit or something. It was a bit odd for a front door, but we weren't too worried at the time. We unlocked the door and headed downstairs into the basement. The place looked fine at first. It was a bit smaller than we expected, but nothing too bad. There was a couch, a TV, a little kitchenette with a mini fridge, and 2 twin beds crammed into the small bedroom. The ceiling was low, and there were tiny windows near the top of the walls, letting in just a sliver of daylight. It had that slightly damp, musty smell that basements tend to have. But again, it didn't seem like a big deal. We weren't planning to spend much time there anyway.
We dropped our bags, checked out the place, and then decided to head into the city for dinner. On our way out, we fumbled with the padlock a bit. It didn't seem to fit the door properly, like it was too loose or something. After a few tries, we managed to lock it and headed out. That night, we had a great time. We hit a few bars, checked out some local spots, and didn't get back to the Airbnb until late. By the time we got back, we were pretty tired and just wanted to crash for the night. When we got to the door, though, we noticed that the padlock was gone. Not hanging open or dangling from the door, it was *gone*. At first, we thought maybe we hadn't locked it properly earlier, but that didn't make sense because we both clearly remembered struggling with it before leaving. We stood there for a second, just staring at the door, trying to figure out what to do. We were tired, a little drunk, and didn't really feel like dealing with it. So we shrugged it off and went inside. Everything inside looked the same as when we'd left. Our bags were untouched, the lights were still off, and nothing seemed out of place. We locked the door from the inside using the flimsy internal bolt and went to bed. I remember thinking that the whole padlock situation was weird, but I was too exhausted to care. That night I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but it was hard to tell through the ceiling. I thought maybe it was just the host or someone else in the house, so I didn't pay much attention. But then I heard the front door creak. You know that unmistakable sound of a door being opened slowly, as if someone's trying not to make too much noise? That's exactly what it sounded like. I lay there frozen, listening. The footsteps were now on the stairs coming down toward the basement. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The footsteps got closer, but then they stopped. There was complete silence for what felt like forever. I didn't want to wake my friend, and I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, so I just stayed still. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because the next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight coming through the tiny windows. I told my friend about the footsteps the next morning, but she didn't seem too worried. She figured it was just the host or someone else in the house, but she hadn't heard anything. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to dwell on it. We had plans for the day and I wanted to enjoy the trip, so we left the basement and headed back into the city. When we got back that evening, though, things started to feel off again. As soon as we walked into the basement, I noticed that our bags had been moved. It wasn't obvious at first, but my suitcase, which I had left by the bed, was now halfway across the room. My friend's stuff had been shifted around too. She noticed it immediately, and we both just stood there trying to process what had happened. We hadn't left the door unlocked, and we hadn't told anyone we were staying there except for the host. There were no signs of a break-in, no broken windows, nothing. At that point, we were both freaked out. We tried calling the host, but her number went straight to voicemail. We sent a message through Airbnb, but again, no response. We debated leaving, but it was late and we didn't know where else to go. Plus, we still had all of our stuff there. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe we'd just been careless, that we hadn't locked the door properly, or that the host had come in for some reason and didn't tell us. None of it made sense, but we didn't have any other explanation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the footsteps from the night before and the fact that someone had clearly been in the basement while we were out. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, listening for any signs of movement. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the front door creaking open. This time, I was sure of it. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. I nudged my friend awake, and she immediately heard it too. We both lay there, not moving, not sure what to do. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. There was this long pause, like whoever was out there was listening, waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. We didn't have any weapons, nothing to defend ourselves with. We were trapped. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps turned around and went back up the stairs. The door creaked again, and then everything was silent. We didn't move for the rest of the night. We just lay there, terrified, listening for any more sounds. But there was nothing. At dawn, we packed our bags and left without looking back. We didn't even bother locking the door behind us. We drove straight to a hotel in downtown Seattle and spent the rest of the weekend trying to figure out what the hell had happened. We tried contacting the host again, but she never responded. We reported the incident to Airbnb, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. They refunded us for the stay, but that was it. No explanation, no follow-up. To this day, I have no idea who was in that house with us or what their intentions were. All I know is that someone was inside the basement while we were out, and they came back in the middle of the night. It still gives me chills thinking about it.
This happened earlier this year when I went to Chicago for work. It wasn't my first time traveling for work, but it was the first time I decided to stay in an Airbnb instead of a hotel. My company had booked me for a week-long stay, and since I didn't want to spend all that time in a boring hotel room, I thought it'd be nicer to get a place with a bit more personality, maybe a kitchen where I could make my own meals. You know, just something that felt a little more like home. I found this Airbnb in a high-rise apartment building near the Loop, close to where my meetings would be. It was listed as a modern, stylish apartment with a view of the city skyline, which honestly looked great from the photos. The reviews were mostly positive and the location was perfect. Close enough to downtown that I wouldn't have to deal with a long commute, but far enough that it wasn't in the middle of all the hustle and bustle. I booked it without thinking too much about it. It seemed like the perfect spot for the week. I arrived in Chicago on a Monday afternoon. The check-in process was straightforward. I got the keys from a lockbox in the lobby and took the elevator up to the 10th floor where the apartment was. The building was one of those newer high-rise towers with a clean, minimalist lobby and a sleek, modern design. It felt safe, and I was glad for that since I'd be staying alone. The apartment itself was nice, exactly like the pictures. It had floor-to-ceiling windows with a great view of the city, a small kitchen with everything I'd need, and a decent-sized living area with a couch and TV. It was clean and tidy, but it didn't have that lived-in feel you get in someone's home. Still, it was perfect for what I needed, a place to crash after long days of meetings and conference calls. The first night was uneventful. I was pretty exhausted from traveling, so after grabbing some takeout, I just watched some TV and went to bed early. The bedroom was small but comfortable, and the blinds on the window blocked out most of the city lights. I slept fine, no issues. Things didn't start getting weird until the second night. I got back to the apartment after a long day of meetings and decided to relax for a bit by the window. The view was pretty incredible, especially with the city all lit up at night. I was looking out at the skyline when I noticed a guy in the building across from mine. He was standing at his window, looking in my direction. I figured it was just one of those things where you accidentally make eye contact with a stranger, so I didn't think much of it at first. I looked away, tried to ignore it, and went about my evening. Later that night after dinner, I opened the blinds again to get some air before going to bed. That's when I saw him again, the same guy, standing at his window, staring straight at me. He was a couple floors up in the building across from mine, not too far away, but far enough that I couldn't make out his face clearly. It wasn't just a glance this time. He was standing there, not moving, just looking into my apartment. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I figured it was just a coincidence. I shut the blinds and tried to shake it off. The next day was busy. I had back-to-back meetings, and by the time I got back to the apartment, I was exhausted. I'd almost forgotten about the guy from the night before, but when I went to open the blinds again, there he was, standing at the same window. This time, I could feel that something was off. He wasn't just looking out into the city, he was definitely staring into my apartment. I closed the blinds immediately, trying to ignore the creepy feeling it gave me. I convinced myself that it was nothing, that maybe he was just someone who liked looking out at the view or something. I didn't want to freak myself out over what was probably just a random stranger. That night, I slept with the blinds closed, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept waking up, glancing at the window, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. It felt silly, but it was starting to mess with my head. The next day, I was on edge.
I had another long day of work ahead, but all I could think about was that guy. When I got back to the apartment, I was almost scared to open the blinds. I hesitated for a while, but eventually I couldn't help myself. I opened them just a crack and peeked out. He was there again. This time I couldn't ignore it. He wasn't just staring out into the distance. He was staring right at me. And he didn't look away when I saw him. I quickly shut the blinds again, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I mean, what could I do? It wasn't like he was doing anything illegal. He was just in his own apartment, looking out his window. But there was something about the way he was watching me that felt so wrong. It was unsettling, like he was waiting for something. I tried to distract myself with work, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me all evening. I didn't want to tell anyone because I felt like they'd just think I was being paranoid. After all, it was a big city, and people look out their windows all the time. Still, it was hard to shake the anxiety. That night, I kept the blinds shut and didn't even glance out the window. The following day, things escalated. I came back to the apartment in the late afternoon and found an envelope taped to my door. There was no name on it, no return address, just my apartment number. I opened it, and inside was a single piece of paper with my name written on it in shaky handwriting. Nothing else, just my first name in big, bold letters. My stomach dropped. I had no idea who could have left it. The Airbnb host had never mentioned anything about sending me notes or mail, and I hadn't given anyone the address of where I was staying. I immediately thought of the guy across the street. I didn't know how he could have known my name, but the timing felt too perfect. I was freaked out, but I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like I could call the cops and tell them some guy had been watching me from across the street, and now there was a note with my name on it. There was no proof that the two things were connected, but my gut was telling me they were. I called the host and asked if anyone else had access to the apartment, or if there was any reason someone would leave a note for me. She sounded surprised and told me that no one else had access. I didn't mention the guy across the street because, again, I didn't have any real proof, but I could tell that she thought I was overreacting. She suggested I take the note to the building management, which I did, but they were just as confused as I was. They said they'd keep an eye on things but didn't seem too concerned. That night, I didn't even open the blinds. I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into my chest. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I kept thinking about that guy in the window staring at me. I wondered if he could see me through the blinds, if he was watching even now. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the apartment, every noise from the hallway made me jump. At one point I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, but when I checked, there was no one there. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find another note taped to my door. This one was different. It was another piece of paper, but instead of my name, there was just one word written on it. *leave. *. That was it. No explanation, no signature, nothing else. Just that one word, scrawled across the paper in the same shaky handwriting. My heart was pounding as I stared at it. Whoever had left it knew where I was staying, and they clearly wanted me out. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my stuff as quickly as I could, called my boss, and told him I needed to leave early. I didn't give him any details, just that something had come up and I needed to cut the trip short. He wasn't thrilled, but he didn't push it. I booked a hotel downtown and got out of there as fast as I could. I never found out who left those notes or if it had anything to do with the guy across the street. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe he was watching me the whole time, waiting for the right moment to mess with my head. I'll never know for sure. A few years ago, I booked a weekend trip for myself to get away from everything. I had been feeling burnt out from work and just needed some time alone. I'd been to Vermont a few times and always loved how peaceful it felt, so I thought it would be the perfect place to unwind. I found this small cabin on Airbnb, advertised as being remote and secluded. That sounded exactly like what I needed. The listing said it was about 30 minutes from Stowe, and the photos showed this cozy little place tucked away in the woods. It had a wood-burning stove, a small porch, and looked like it was miles away from civilization. I didn't hesitate to book it. I planned the trip for a weekend, leaving Friday after work. It was a 4-hour drive from where I lived in Boston, and I figured I'd get to the cabin just after dark. I didn't mind arriving late. I liked the idea of showing up to this quiet, isolated spot with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. I left around 5 p.m. and the drive was easy enough for the first couple of hours, but as I got closer to Stowe, things started to feel a little more remote. The roads narrowed, streetlights became few and far between, and my cell service started getting spotty. Eventually, I lost service completely, but I wasn't too concerned since I had already saved the directions from Airbnb. The last leg of the drive was the trickiest. The road to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path that wound through the trees, and it was completely dark by the time I got there. The instructions from the host said to follow the road for about a mile until I saw a small clearing on the left where the cabin would be. There weren't any signs or markers, so I was just going by distance and hoping I was in the right place. After what felt like forever, I spotted a clearing through the trees and pulled in. The cabin was there, looking exactly like the photos, small, rustic, with a porch that faced the woods. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The cabin was simple, but perfect for what I needed. It had one main room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and the wood stove. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and I knew there wouldn't be cell service, so I was prepared for a weekend of being completely disconnected. I unpacked, got the fire going in the stove, and made myself some tea before settling into bed. I fell asleep pretty quickly, feeling good about getting away from it all. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds outside and sunlight streaming through the windows. It felt amazing to be away from the city. I spent most of the day hiking on a nearby trail I'd read about before the trip, and when I got back to the cabin in the afternoon, I was exhausted but happy. The cabin was quiet, just as I'd left it, and I spent the rest of the evening reading and relaxing by the fire. That night, things started to feel a little off. Around midnight, I was in bed half asleep when I heard a car engine outside. That alone was strange because as far as I knew, there wasn't anyone around for miles. The cabin was supposed to be isolated and the dirt road I'd driven on didn't lead anywhere else, so I couldn't think of any reason why someone would be out there. I got out of bed and peeked through the curtains. Sure enough, there was a truck parked at the edge of the clearing, its headlights cutting through the trees. My heart rate spiked immediately. There was no reason for anyone to be here. I watched for a few minutes, hoping they'd just turn around and leave, but the truck stayed put, engine idling. I didn't know what to do. There wasn't any cell service, so I couldn't call anyone, and the nearest town was probably a half-hour drive away. I considered going outside to see what they wanted, but something told me that wasn't a good idea. I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out my next move. After a few more minutes, the truck's engine finally cut off. I watched as the driver's side door opened and 2 men got out. They stood by the truck for a moment talking to each other, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then they started walking toward the cabin. Panic set in. I hadn't locked the door when I came in that night, so I quietly rushed to lock it before they got any closer. The cabin was small, with no other exit except for the front door. My mind was racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Who were these guys? Why were they here? I crouched by the window, watching as they came closer. One of them was holding a flashlight, shining it around the clearing, while the other one walked up to the porch. He tried the door handle, and when it didn't open, he knocked. Softly at first, then louder. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't know what their intentions were, but nothing about this felt right. After a few minutes of knocking, the guy on the porch turned to the other and said something I couldn't make out.
The second guy came up to the porch and they both stood there for a while, muttering to each other. They tried the door again,
and when it didn't budge, they stepped back. I thought maybe they were going to leave, but then I saw one of them pull something out of his jacket. A crowbar. My heart sank. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. My car was parked just a few feet from theirs, and even if I could get to it, the road was too rough to drive fast enough to get away. I felt completely trapped. They started prying at the door, the wood creaking as the crowbar dug into it. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. There was nothing in the cabin that I could use to defend myself, just some kitchen knives and a fire poker, but neither of those would be much use against two grown men. Just as they were about to get the door open, one of them suddenly stopped. He turned to the other guy and said something, and they both froze. Then they backed away from the door, hurried down the steps, and got into the truck. I watched in disbelief as they started the engine and drove off, the sound of the truck fading into the night. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just stayed by the window, watching the clearing, trying to figure out what had just happened. Why did they leave so suddenly? What were they even doing here in the first place? Eventually, I worked up the nerve to check the door. The wood was splintered where they'd been prying at it, but it was still intact, though it wouldn't have held much longer. I checked the windows too, but they hadn't tried to break those. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something horrible. The next morning, I packed up my things and left as soon as the sun came up. I didn't even make breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that truck again. When I finally got back into town, I found a gas station with cell service and called the Airbnb host. I told him what had happened, and there was a long silence on the other end. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. I had stayed at the wrong cabin. Apparently, there were two cabins in the area, both owned by the same family. The one I had booked was farther down the road, but because there were no clear signs or markings, I had accidentally gone to the wrong one. The cabin I had stayed in belonged to someone else entirely, someone who wasn't on Airbnb and didn't rent their property out. The guys in the truck were probably the owners or people who knew them, and they had no idea why a stranger was staying in their cabin. That explained why they were trying to break in. They thought I was trespassing. I was lucky they didn't force their way in, or worse. The host apologized, said it was a mix-up, but by that point, I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. I never reported it to Airbnb or anyone else. It didn't seem worth it. But looking back, it terrifies me to think about how close I came to being in real danger. If they had broken in, who knows what would have happened. All because I'd gone to the wrong cabin. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I've been cautious about staying in remote places ever since. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a much-needed vacation. We'd both been working non-stop for months, and we were desperate to get away from the stress. We didn't want to go anywhere too crowded, so we settled on a quiet beach town in South Carolina, Pawleys Island. It was far enough from the touristy spots, and we found a beachfront Airbnb that seemed perfect. The listing promised a cozy, peaceful house just steps from the water, and the pictures showed a quaint little cottage with white shutters and a wraparound porch. It looked like the kind of place where you could truly relax. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The house was even better in person. Exactly what we were hoping for. It was a classic beach house tucked away behind a few palm trees with the ocean just visible over the dunes. The host wasn't there to meet us, but she had left the keys in a lockbox and everything seemed fine. The place was clean if a little old, but we didn't mind. The charm of the house was part of what made it feel like a real getaway from city life. The first thing we noticed, though, was a slight smell. It wasn't overwhelming, just a faint musty odor that I figured was probably normal for an older beach house. I'd rented places at the shore before, and they always had that damp, salty smell. No big deal. We opened the windows to let in some fresh air and spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and getting settled in. That evening, we sat out on the porch, watching the sunset and drinking wine. The breeze off the ocean was warm, and it felt amazing to finally unwind. After dinner, we watched a movie and went to bed early. The bedroom was small with a window that overlooked the beach, and the bed was soft and comfortable. I remember falling asleep almost instantly, feeling totally at ease. The next morning I woke up with a headache. It wasn't terrible, but it was there, this dull, throbbing pressure behind my eyes. My girlfriend said she wasn't feeling great either, a bit nauseous, but we both brushed it off as travel fatigue. It was nothing that would ruin our trip, and we were determined to enjoy the weekend. We made breakfast and decided to spend the day on the beach. We spent most of the day lounging in the sun, swimming and reading. By the time we got back to the house, we were both exhausted. That's when I noticed the smell again. It seemed stronger now, more noticeable than when we first arrived. It was still that same musty odor, but it felt heavier somehow, like it was lingering in the air. I checked the windows, making sure they were still open, and they were, but it didn't seem to help. That night, my headache got worse. I took some painkillers before bed, hoping it would pass, but when I woke up the next morning, the pain was still there. It was more intense now, and I felt groggy and disoriented, like I hadn't slept at all. My girlfriend looked pale, and she said she felt lightheaded and nauseous again. Something was definitely off, but we couldn't figure out what. We hadn't eaten anything unusual, and we hadn't had much to drink the night before. The only thing we could think of was maybe the heat had gotten to us. By the third day, things were getting worse. The smell in the house was almost overpowering now, and every time we stepped inside, it hit us like a wave. It wasn't just musty anymore, it smelled damp, like wet wood or mildew. My headache hadn't gone away, and now my girlfriend was feeling even sicker. She could barely eat without feeling nauseous, and we both felt exhausted all the time, even though we were sleeping for hours. I started to get worried that something was wrong with the house. I'd read about people getting sick from mold, and even though I couldn't see any obvious signs, I couldn't shake the feeling that the smell was coming from something in the walls. I went around the house, checking every corner, but there wasn't any visible mold. No black spots, no stains, nothing. The walls looked clean. Still, the smell was there, and it was getting worse. I tried calling the Airbnb host to let her know what was going on, but I couldn't get through. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and when I messaged her through the app, I didn't get a response. We debated leaving early, but I kept telling myself that maybe we were overreacting. I didn't want to ruin the vacation, and we had already paid for the week. Besides, it didn't seem like there was anywhere else nearby we could stay on such short notice. That night, we both slept horribly. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I could barely breathe. The air in the house felt thick and humid, like the windows had all been sealed shut, even though they were wide open. My girlfriend was tossing and turning next to me, and I could tell she was having a hard time too. We both felt trapped in this suffocating space, but I was too exhausted to do anything about it. The next morning, we decided we couldn't stay there anymore. My girlfriend was feeling too sick to even get out of bed, and I felt like my head was going to explode. I called a local urgent care clinic to see if they could squeeze us in, and after describing our symptoms, they told us to come in right away. At the clinic, the doctor took one look at us and asked if we had been exposed to mold. I explained the situation with the Airbnb, how we had noticed the smell when we first arrived, and how it had gotten worse over the past few days. He nodded and said it sounded like we were having a reaction to mold exposure. He explained that even if we couldn't see it, there could be mold growing inside the walls or under the floorboards, especially in an older, damp house like the one we were staying in. He advised us to leave immediately and not go back until the place had been inspected and cleaned by professionals. That was all I needed to hear. As soon as we left the clinic, we drove back to the house, packed up our things as quickly as we could, and got out of there. I didn't care that we still had a few days left on the rental. I just wanted to leave. The minute we stepped inside to grab our bags, the smell hit us again, even stronger than before. It was like the whole house was soaked in it, and I felt sick to my stomach just being there. We ended up driving back home that same day, cutting the trip short. I tried contacting the Airbnb host again, but she never responded. I left a review warning other people about the smell and our experience.
but I noticed that a few days later, the listing was taken down completely. I don't know if Airbnb did anything about it or if the host just deleted the listing, but I never got a follow-up. It took us weeks to start feeling normal again. Even after we left the house, the headaches and fatigue lingered. My girlfriend had to see a doctor a few more times because her symptoms were worse than mine, and she was convinced the mold had done some kind of long-term damage. It was scary how something we couldn't even see had such a strong effect on us. Looking back, I can't believe we stayed in that house as long as we did. We should have trusted our instincts and left the moment we noticed something was wrong. I guess we didn't want to admit that our perfect vacation was turning into a nightmare. But now, I know better. If I ever smell that musty, damp odor again, I'm getting out immediately. It's just not worth the risk.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.